That's no Paul 40.
Ha! Well, look at that. Uh, okay, so actually I think we're in 9, so I need to change my thing to 9, right? We're in part 9 now? Amazing. Sorry, I mean this drags on, but what do you do, right? I get excited by all this.
This will be the trimester we finish, right?
Yeah, maybe
The quarter we finish.
a year or so, yeah. Ha!
Yeah.
This is difficult stuff, right? This is difficult for me. I know it's difficult for you, so we'll just keep pushing. This is my favorite word in the whole world anyway. Pistis, well, metaphthumi is probably my most favorite, but pistis is the word probably more used in the New Testament anywhere, meaning to be persuaded. But here's some neat words that we'll find in the scripture. We get to 7. Let's see. Should I write a K or a C? I guess we'll do a K. K-A-T-E-S-K-E-U-A-S-E-N. Kata, that's our kata, down. And skuos. Skuos. Let's see how you spell it. S-K, skuos. S-K-E-U-O-S. Skuos. Down, and this is a vessel. This is one of, people given, I never can figure out why people have such a negative impression about the view of Christianity and women, because of the words that are used are so obvious to what they're trying to impart. And skuios is one of those words, because in the Greek, skuios specifically means, you look at I get the definition in there, a vessel, an implement, equipment, or apparatus. And in Greek, specifically a wife as contributing to the usefulness of the husband. So, whether you like we call it a patriarchal view. Remember, I've told you, the reason people are patriarchal in the old world is because might makes right. And personally, if I were a woman or a child or a disabled person or a handicapped person, I would want a patriarchal society so I have someone to protect me. Because if might makes right, you are toast if you're not strong, period. So this idea of skuios means that a man can't be complete in the Greek worldview without a woman. And we see this word used extensively in the New Testament. So down skuios means specifically to be completely prepared or prepare thoroughly. What really intrigues me about this word is the implication here, just by the use of the word, is that you can't be prepared completely unless you have what? Unless you have a woman, right? I mean, well, maybe you don't get it as deeply as I think this really is. In the Hebrew worldview, what is the crown of creation?
Woman.
Woman is the crown of creation. And not only that, even though it cracks me up, the Orthodox Jews pray, one of the missions they pray every day is, I thank God I was not made a woman. But yet, in Orthodox Judaism, a woman is considered the crown of creation, and the reason she doesn't have to do certain mitzvahs is because she is a woman and therefore higher than a man. And by the way, the Jews believe that Eve did not sin. Eve was not bound by the initial covenant with Adam, and she did not sin. Adam sinned. So Eve was not only created as a peak of creation, and by the way, women have perfect chromosomes where men have a broken chromosome. There is only man and woman. There's no such thing as gender. There is only sex. And there is XX, which is woman, the perfect chromosome. And there is XY, the broken chromosome. And it's really interesting that God took a rib from Adam to make Eve the perfect. Anyway, So in the Hebrew worldview, even the Orthodox who pray, thank God I was not made a woman, which is amazing, and women have, matter of fact, the women in Hebrew are the only ones who can do the calling of the light, right? You guys seen Anatevka, right? The fiddle on the roof, and they do the calling of the light. That, what's that called anyway? They light the candles at just before Shabbat. Only women can do that. Men cannot do that. So in Hebrew thought and theory, philosophy, women are the peak of creation. In Greek theory, women are a little bit different, but yet they are considered the completing vessel to men. So when the word is used, which I love this word, to complete thoroughly, kataskuos, it's amazing. I just think it's interesting that this word is used that way. And of course, Paul writes, in Christ there is no slave or free, man or woman, whatever. And I think that's just a beautiful statement of Christianity right there.
Hey, well,
Yes, sir.
not to draw away too much, but you use down quite a bit. What do the Greeks mean whenever they start with down?
Down, if you look at the thing it says, it's a primary participle. It means down in place or time and in varied relations according to the case. That is like the three cases of what we call it nominative, genitive, and accusative and dative, the four cases that you can have for stuff. But most specifically, when they say down, meaning that it's really hard to translate. It's one of those prepositions, right? And prepositions are complex kind of things. But in the most, in a imperfect sense, meaning let's see. Okay, I have my skuios, I have my vessel. And my vessel is down. So it is, I've taken the vessel and I've put it in the correct place for its usage. So this is probably really close to the kata, what they're trying to say. So I can have something, I could have a skuios in a cabinet. I could have a skuios hanging on the wall. I could have a skuios placed over here on a ledge. I can have the skuios, but if I do down skuios, I've taken the skuios and I've placed it in the perfect place for it to be used for its purpose. So when in the Greek sense of down, kata, meaning, this is not a complete meaning. I'm simplifying it. But just like we would say on or in, down in that context means it is in its proper place. And you notice we don't have a preposition that means that in English, right? Kata can mean specifically down, right? But down isn't a pure preposition in English. See? Prepositions are complex. And usually what you do, I don't know if you guys, when you study, I won't ask questions who studied a foreign language, but when you study a foreign language, what do you remember? They make you memorize all of the prepositions and their declension or their cases, right? Because there's dative, accusative, nominative, and genitive prepositions. Each preposition takes a different case. So prepositions are really complex things in languages, right? And we know that, well, we don't know that. We just use the prepositions we have. And in different languages, they mean different things.
I'm still trying to, I'm gonna say, I'm trying to figure out how to word this with my wife to explain to her. She's an implement piece of equipment.
Well,
If I'm not here next week, there'll be a.
Been good morning.
you don't want to get in trouble, do you, right?
Maybe skip that discussion.
He's just gonna end up completely finished.
Well, if you think about it, there's a lot behind that too, right? Because a vessel for childbirth and a man can't, right? I mean, there's a lot in that word that I think the Greeks, if you haven't noticed, the Greeks throw a lot into a word and expect you to understand a whole bunch about that singular word. And, you know, some of the words are very complex in their meaning and almost impossible for us to simply define. Anyway, here's one that is, I don't think we've ever had this before. You, of course, meaning good. And, well, I should, I guess, spell it L-A-A-B-E-T-H-E-I-S. And this doesn't help you, right? It's actually, this is lambanos. Lambanos. Lambanos means to take. Take good, good take well, taking well. Literally in the Greek meaning carefully. So, the Greeks, okay, you can't forget this about the Greek language. The Greeks believe, and by the way, you do too, that you can take any Greek word and you can look at the prefix and the suffix, the prefix, suffix, and the main part of the word, and do what? Figure it out. They don't have words like we do. Like, let's see, pendant. Pendant, is that the right word? Independent. Independent. Within this word is pendant, dependent, and independent. Pendant. Pendant is an ancient word in Anglo-Saxon meaning that specifically means that you are enslaved. And a slave they didn't get a pendant like we think of a pendant. They got a slave collar. And a slave collar was called a pendant. And so if you were pendant, that meant you were dependent on someone. And the word dependent, right? Pendant, you're enslaved. Dependent, you're not only enslaved, your whole life is dependent, right? That's where the word comes from. Independent. Well, in English doesn't mean like in Greek, right? Anti or separate or right? Independent doesn't exactly mean. So in English, you basically can't do what you can in Greek. We've had too many borrowed words and too much English, in too much language. But the Greeks believe, and I think I found very few cases where it's not true. The Greeks believe emphatically, to the point that one of the Socratic dialogues is about words and the elements of Greek language. They believe that you can take every suffix and verb and prefix and figure out exactly what the word means. They mean what they say. That's the Greek worldview. That is part of the Greek worldview. And by the way, why do I say we believe that too? Because when you studied for the SAT and the ACT, what did you do? Prefixes and suffixes, because the assumption was that every single one of them would lead you to understand the English meaning if the word was hopefully Greek or Latin. Because that's the way the world is, right? In the Greek and Latin worldview. So, anyway. But it's really interesting, this good take, or take well, right? Lambano means to take. And that's the word we've had before. So, with this in mind, let's go. I'm not going to re-parse 6. I do want to remind you, I've stuck it on the top. 1. But persuasion stands under expectation of proof of deeds not seen. That's verse 1 in the Pistis chapter. And 2. Assigning a reason in this, the members of the Israelite Sanhedrin became a witness. Which means that every single point in this chapter is supposed to point back to Christ. The point of this whole expression of a logos to telos is to go back to Christ. In 5, we had the expectation, or I'll read it. I'll read the translation and the, I won't reparse it or anything like that. But in 5 we had, by faith Enoch, this is NIV, was taken from this life so that he did not experience death. He could not be found because God had taken him away. Before he was taken, he was commended as one who pleased God. Literally, this is a translation, a better translation from the literal. Through persuasion, Enoch was transferred to heaven so as not to see death, and was not found on the very account that God himself transferred him, assigning a reason before his transportation to heaven. He became a witness by completely gratifying God. And then we have in 6, here's the NIV. And without faith it is impossible to please God, because anyone who comes to him must believe that he exists, and what he rewards those who earnestly seek him. However, we parse this, and the direct literal translation of 6 is a displacement of the mind at a space, persuasion by a logical argument, unable, impossible to gratify entirely, assigning a reason, thee to approach, to come near the God. It is necessary to be persuaded by a logical argument that he is, and to cause to be a remunerator, thee to search out himself. Okay, this is really complex. Here is a translation of that puts it all together within what we parsed. A displacement of the mind at a space from persuasion. So, a displacement of the mind. I don't know how to draw that. So, a displacement of the mind. So, I'm a thinking, and my thinking is a displacement of the mind. In the Greek, that means like a trance, a stare, stasis, it comes from, it's ecstasis. So, a displacement of the mind at a space, it's choris, at a space from persuasion by a logical argument. So, logos to telos. Okay? So I'm at a space. I'm separated. I got a break from logos to telos. Is impossible to gratify entirely. Is impossible. So, if you're not thinking right, if you're not thinking clearly, if you're not able to process, then you have a displacement of the mind from a logos to telos, from a persuasion, from a persuasive argument, a logical argument. Okay? So if you're not clear about what specifically do you think? We'll find out. It's impossible to gratify. You can't gratify a displacement of the mind assigning a reason that come near the God. In other words, to come near to God. What does it mean to come near to God? To understand God, right? So we're saying, why do I have displacement of the mind? Because I want to understand God. Understand God, the Father, Christ, and the Holy Spirit. I want to understand it. But I have a displacement of the mind. The reason I have that displacement of the mind is because I have a space that's separating me from a logical argument. It goes on. To come near to the God, it is necessary to be persuaded. Okay, listen to this. This answers the question completely. Assigning a reason, the come near the God, it is necessary to be persuaded by a logical argument that he is. That he is. So the answer to this is what? To be persuaded. To be persuaded, though, you have to have a logical argument. What is the logical argument? At the very beginning of this chapter, and I would say this isn't the beginning of this logos to telos, but the first verse is, but persuasion stands under an expectation of proof of deeds not seen. of deeds not seen. Did anybody see Enoch get taken away? No. He was transferred by God. And so no one saw it, but what's the proof text? That he wasn't there anymore, right? He was gone. And so the point of this is, what is the Logos to tell us? And of course the author, we know the answer because we've been reading the whole of Hebrews. The answer from the very beginning is the, I can't spell it, the euangelia. The angelia. The good news, the good message from the gods, which is the gospel. And it continues. And he is, and to cause to be a remunerator to those who search out himself. Now, this goes back to remember back in the previous chapter, we had that para, we had a para word, and I can't remember what the para word was. Ek para, something para, kata para, I don't remember which one of the para words. We'd had a new para word. And I told you that that word specifically means a remunerator. Last week we had this specific word which means remunerator. It's misanthrotes. But it's a remunerator. There's a little bit difference between the two different types of remunerators. But the point before was that they were supposed to be a remunerator, the leftover part. The leftover part. Remember? They came from Jerusalem. The assumption, I think it's a good assumption, they came from Jerusalem to wherever they came. I think Alexandria. They're in Alexandria. This is written to the Alexandrian Jews, Gentiles, everybody. To the Greeks, Romans, to the Egyptians. So they came from Jerusalem where they were celebrating Tin Hodos daily in the temple by sacrificing. And they came to a place where there was a temple. And so we have some of them that they talk about in the previous chapter. Some of them are continuing to sacrifice in the illegal temple in Alexandria. That's not good. The writers say don't do that. But they understand why they're doing it. Then you have the group that are in the episynagogue and not leaving the episynagogue. They're not getting out. They're not spreading the gospel. They're not talking to their neighbors. They're not doing what the authors think they should be doing to continue the spread of Christ, of Christianity, of Tin Hodos, and to express the truth in their culture. I would say they're not as interested in the spread of Christianity. They believe that's going to happen anyway. What they're interested in is the spread of the truth through their culture. If you know the truth, you don't hide it under a bushel, and they've talked about that too, right? The light, the phos, the whole 9 yards. So the point of this is, who are the remunerator? The remunerator are those who are persuaded. The remunerator are those who don't have a displacement of the mind. So I would argue that this is entirely mistranslated. The NIV says, and without faith it is impossible to please God, because anyone who comes to him must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who earnestly seek him. That's not what it says. It says, a displacement of the mind and the space from persuasion by a logical argument is impossible to gratify entirely. The reason I use the word gratify entirely is because Enoch, before gratified God entirely. Why did he gratify God entirely? How could he gratify God entirely? And why was he not at a space from persuasion, from pistis? It says it in the Old Testament. Because he walked with God. In other words, if you walk with God, there's no space, right? I mean, if God's right here with me, well, I hope you're persuaded. If God is right here, you hopefully would be persuaded that God is, right? Because he's here. Like, I'm persuaded that you exist because you're here, right? And so Enoch walked with God, therefore he was not at a space, a kodesh, from God or from persuasion. So a displacement of mind at a space from persuasion by a logical argument is impossible to gratify entirely. In other words, you can't gratify God. Assigning a reason, the come near the God, to be able to come near God, it is necessary to be persuaded by a logical argument that he is, and to cause to be a renumerator those who search out himself. In other words, they are persuasion by the logical argument, which is the gospel, leads you to conclude that God must be. And if you're not persuaded about God, then what do? You walk around, and we know it's true, right? You know it's true. You ever talk to some of these atheists or some of these guys? Or how about Hawkins? You know, Hawkins is supposed to be those brilliant mind forever and ever, but you know what he said caused the Big Bang? Aliens. Aliens had created a previous culture and previous intellectual stuff, and these genius aliens had been able to put into the Big Bang the ability to remake the universe.
You mean Dawkins?
No, there's Hawkins.
Hawking.
Hawkins.
Oh.
Hawkins. And, well, also, what's the other guy? Bullions and Bullions. Carlson. You know, Carl Sagan. You know, talk about middle midgets in a modern world, right? Middle midgets. They're pure atheists, and I would argue that no person can be an atheist today based on what we know about philosophy and science and history. I mean, you can't be an honest student. You can be a dishonest student, right? Just like Hawking said, the world, you know, that obviously multiple instances of Big Bang were caused by super intelligent aliens who had, you know, programmed the Big Bang to create life in each thing. Because you know why they have to say that, right? You know why they're looking for life. I've said it before, is because there's no way that a universe, science thinks the universe is 20 billion years old. It takes 60 billion years for you to produce life through the most simple, if you do a probability study, it is impossible in probability to create for life to come together in a meaningful sequence without 60 billion years. This is Hawking's problem. This is a problem of modern cosmology. Not cosmetology, cosmology, right? So the problem with modern cosmology is the world, the universe is too young, and how old is the Earth supposed to be? Anybody know?
4.5 or 5 billion years old.
5 billion. Guess what? 5 billion is way too short. So where did the life have to come from?
Somewhere else.
Outer space. That's why they have all these Mars missions and CD programs.
We're always looking for life somewhere
But
else.
it's always illogical because, all right, who made the aliens? It just keeps going back and back and back.
Bingo! You have hit it, brother! This is the problem. You know, okay, if I define God and I say, God, you know, and I'm not going to define all the assumptions of God, but if I do a logical argument, right, we have a logos, a logical argument in English. We start with definitions, assumptions. We have our proof, and our conclusions, right? So your definitions of God, super intelligent, right? Intelligent beyond whatever, omnipresent, omnipotent, all this. Well, what's these super aliens? Omnipresent, super brain, right? And even able to project themselves through time. What is that a definition of? It's God. It's a little g God, but it's a God. So Hawkins is hawking a God, but he calls them aliens. Oh, and we're supposed to be intellectually satisfied with that? All you can do is look at these people like Carl Sagan and Hawkins and go, are you an idiot? I mean, did you never ever study philosophy or theology or any of the ologies? Or did you just stick your nose in a science book your whole life and never get beyond, the third grade in your basic reasoning ability? I mean, this is what we call, it's gross ignorance of the most basic things in the world, right? So the point of this, and remember, if you remember before, the previous verses or phrases we had in the Greek specified, they said that God created, and the fact that God created is evidence in itself. And I told you that's what the Big Bang proves. If you have you guys probably don't know this because you don't teach this stuff anymore, but for a bazillion years, we believed in what's called eternal universe. The universe was eternal. If the universe is eternal, there was no creation. And all the atheists and everybody who was so scientifically, great said, yay, that means there can't be God. There's no creation. And then all of a sudden somebody figured out the Big Bang. Oh, that ruined science. Because that means there is no eternal universe. The Big Bang proves creation. Creation proves there has to be a telic cause.
I'm still trying to say that, though, that it just keeps happening over and over, right? That it's basically an eternal universe that just keeps, like, Big Bang, then it collapses, and it expands, blows up again.
Oh, they would love to believe that. The problem is that it doesn't appear to be slowing down, and it doesn't appear that they've been trying to do eternally expanding universe and contracting universe forever and ever. The only problem is you still have to have a telic cause. In other words, when it squishes down, right, what causes it to suddenly go again, right?
You had to input some energy at the beginning somewhere.
No, you can't do that. That would break all the laws of physics that we know. And if it breaks the laws of physics, it means it's
Supernatural.
Supernatural, yeah.
That's right. It's outside the cosmos. That's why, look, we stopped teaching people this stuff, and I think it's the most important thing in the whole world to know because the Greeks figured it out 3,000 years ago almost, and we are still, we cut our kids' knees off because we don't teach them some of those basic things about philosophy and theology that were, and when I say philosophy, when I say theology, philosophy was theology for a long, long time. It only divided out basically at the beginning of the 20th century. So the cosmos and this concept of the cosmos and God, these are basic kind of things that, well, I was writing in my blog about, time and history and stuff like that, is think about the history of education. At one time, every educated person knew Greek, Latin, their own language, and some other languages, and were taught that. In Britain, if you go to grammar school or private school, they still teach. If you go to public school, they don't. But their grammar school is basically one of their types of public schools. If you go to their private and grammar school, you learn multiple languages. You have to test into those schools. But the average really educated person in the world knows these things. And guess what? If you study Greek philosophy and Greek ideas. Now, I don't know how they're teaching them today. I hope they're just not teaching them Greek. I hope they're teaching them the actual ideas of the Greeks, because that's what matters. The Greeks' ideas are the beginning of Western civilization. Well, maybe they're not.
But they still buy into this stuff.
What's that?
They teach them that, but then they still buy into this stuff, so that's not the overall answer either, to teach them the
I
philosophy
don't know,
of
I
the Greeks.
never really got any philosophy in my public education.
Really? That's, I actually had a philosophy class. And when I was in college, I was able to have some philosophy classes that was required by my university. I went to Pacific Lutheran University, And I had a really awesome class in philosophy that was taught taught in conjunction with the mathematics department. They didn't do Boolean stuff, but they basically taught philosophy. And all we did was we got the book of the classics, the Greeks and the Roman classics, and that's what we read. Zeno, Socrates, Plato, the Aristotle, all the other nether ones. Still got the books someplace. But these things, I think, are critical to understanding not only our civilization, but understanding some of the most basic things in the world. And by the way, why do they study Greek? They wanted to understand the Bible and the Bible era because they believed, okay, I have to say this because it's absolutely true. Today we believe every culture is the same, right? Every culture is the same. No, they're not better than others. They're all good, right? Even the Aztecs who rip people's hearts out, and people who sacrifice, and the Toffets of the, what's that group? The ones that, whatever his name fought, that eventually became the ones who fought Rome. The Carthaginians, but before that they were the Philistines. The Philistines were the beginnings of the Carthaginians. The Philistines were called the boat people, and they basically went around the Med and captured nations. And by the way, one of the nations they captured was Israel. And they're the ones who built the Toffets, where they sacrificed infants. They did infant sacrifices. They did infanticide to their own children. And there were two great Toffets. The two great Toffets that we know of in the world, one was in Jerusalem. And by the way, it's in that, what's that called? Gehenna. It's in the little river that's in the south where all the trash goes. That Tophet was there. The other Tophet was in Carthage. And by the way, when the Romans finally destroyed Carthage, the Carthaginians at Carthage, there were 3 wars. They did 3 wars. 3 Peloponnesian Wars, 3 Punic Wars. The 3 Punic Wars. The final Punic War, they razed Carthage to the ground and salted the earth because of their Tophet. The Romans could not imagine why they would kill infants, kill children. Yes, sir.
They had soundly defeated the Carthaginians on the battlefield.
Yes.
Carthage had no further military capability, and yet they laid siege to Carthage at great personal cost for that very purpose.
And the reason is, and if you read, what's his name? I didn't know this in my notes, but remember that there's that History of the World. What's his name? History of the World, really famous. I should remember it, but anyway, there's a very famous History of the World written at the beginning of the 20th century, and in that he talks about the reason Rome fell. He talks about the reason Carthage fell, and he also has a section on the Greeks. He has a lot of great information that people should read and used to read all the time. And what he says is the reason they destroyed Carthage was because they were so outraged, morally outraged, because who could imagine killing children? That even bothered the Romans a lot, and they weren't adverse necessarily to killing children when they ravaged nations, right? I mean, it should be astounding to you that nations would consider themselves a moral have moral equivalency or moral strength. So my point is this: the world tells us that all cultures are the same, but we know all cultures are not the same. And so when we see these things, we should recognize that our culture needs can always improve. In fact, it's kind of going downhill, right? But cultures themselves are based in what their moral and their values are as a group. We used to be based on Western civilization and Greek and Hebrew and Christianity. And so we're going way downhill pretty quick. In any case.
Was it Gibbon?
Gibbon, yes, Gibbon. Very good. There's another one too, Gibbon and Gibbon his wife who wrote, but Gibbon is a primary one. So anyway, in 6, I think 6 is a critical and important verse. It is impossible to come near and gratify God unless one is persuaded by a logical argument. Period. Done. This is a simple translation, simple as possible. It is impossible to come near and gratify God unless one is persuaded by a logical argument. So, in other words, I could just come. The guy I was trying to remember last week was Jonathan Edwards. Remember I told you Jonathan Edwards is a mystic. And the reason he was a mystic is because he came to a knowledge of Christ. He was walking through the woods one day. If you read his book, he's walking through the woods one day, and Christ appeared to him in a vision and told him what he wanted him to do. And Jonathan Edwards became he became a great pastor. He became a great defender of Christianity. He was a great philosopher and theologist, and basically developed some of the proofs of God. They didn't stand muster the way Immanuel Kant did, but they were proofs of God that people used in learning and training, and they're enormously powerful proofs. But he was a mystic because he suddenly had a revelation of God. Now that's cool. That's kind of like Enoch, right? How was he persuaded? He saw God. How are we persuaded?
Eyewitness testimony.
Because someone saw God, right? Jonathan Edwards said his testimony was that he saw God. What did Paul say his testimony was?
He saw God.
Remember the very beginning of this? And this is why I keep putting this up here. I love this. This is probably the most beautiful verse in Hebrews. Assigning a reason, in this the members of the Israelite Sanhedrin became a witness. The members of the Israelite Sanhedrin saw Christ, the death of Christ, the resurrection of Christ, and they heard his promise to come again. Were they some of the 500? Yes, sir.
I have a question on that. If I remember the story of Thomas, remember Thomas? How was Thomas persuaded what Jesus said about Thomas? Does that line up with?
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Thomas eventually saw Christ. And Thomas said, okay, all the other disciples, okay, you know, the other disciples were not persuaded until Jesus appeared. Because
They were kind of hanging out, hiding.
they were hiding, right. And matter of fact, when the women went to them and said, we saw Jesus, what did they say?
You're crazy. Yeah.
Yeah, you're nuts, you're crazy, go away. We're hiding, right? And so all the other disciples, when Christ appeared, they saw Christ. And Thomas said, I won't believe, actually, I won't pistis. I won't be persuaded until I see him and put my hands in his nail. Actually, it wasn't in his palms, in his arms. And when he saw, the minute he saw, he said, I am persuaded. And Christ said, here you go, buddy. Put your hands. Remember? He said, I won't be persuaded until, but the minute he saw, he was persuaded. And then Jesus called him on it. I love it. Jesus said, come on. Put your hands right there. Yes, sir.
And then, he was the first of the apostles to make the bold declaration, my Lord and my God.
Yes. He fit it together. And you know what? I think, okay, I'm going to touch the theological pool for just 1 second. But I think the experience of the disciples, the apostles, is the experience that God expects us to go through. I don't think God expects us to have a mystical belief. There are some people in the world that need a punch in the head. Jonathan Edwards, Paul, there are St. Teresa of Avila. There are people through history that have gotten what we call mystic revelation of God. Okay? And many of us, maybe some of us, have had some revelation at some point in our life. Some experience where we feel like we were really close to God. But the reason we became close wasn't because we were suddenly just standing there and the idea struck us in the head, bing, right? We had a revelation because, well, at the extreme, God appeared and said, "Hi, I'm God." And you immediately say, "Okay, cool." Most of us have the experience of, you know, I've studied this, your teachers, your pastors, your other people, someone who led you to Christ, or someone, or your parents, hopefully, or your family, and they said, "Hey, I've been taught this, I know this," right? And that's why we study the Old Testament, the New Testament. That's why we study these things. And that's why I like to study the way we're studying it right now. Because we're basically pulling the onion the bits of the onion apart, and we're looking at in depth. But it's because of that persuasion, that we are persuaded. Yes, sir.
Yeah, but on the back to the Thomas.
Uh-huh.
Jesus said something there. He touched a group of people that if they are, I don't recall the verse where it comes from, but if you read, Jesus said it's blessed to those who just do not have something to persuade them.
Blessed are
Those
those
that have not seen.
have not seen, but are persuaded by a what?
The witness of the others. The
I will-
word.
The Logos Telos. The Greek worldview is about reason, about logic, the scientific method, and the historical method. And so, blessed are those who have not seen. And by the way, did this apply to any of the disciples? No.
It's like for us.
This isn't written for the disciples at all. But blessed are those who have not seen, blibos, but are persuaded through a Logos Telos. In other words, the Logos Telos, and I have to go back to this. This is so important. The Logos Telos that we have is based in the historical method, the scientific method, and logic. And the Greeks would say that as a reasoning person, as a person who, in civilization, I apply the historical method. The historical method tells me that there were 500 witnesses that I have proof text. I have proof text right here. This is the Greek. This is the Greek right here. This was written in the 1st century. In the 1st century, people wrote this down. They were witnesses to the events. This is the historical method right here. I have the historical method. 500 people plus that saw Christ died, resurrected, and went on to make Teen Hodos. And Teen Hodos became the most powerful force in the Western world, and perhaps in the whole world. People actually celebrate Christmas who are Muslims, Hindus, Taoists, Japanese, I don't care who you are. Even the Chinese are celebrating Christmas. Anyway, the scientific method, I've talked about that. The Big Bang Theory, other theories, they have proven it. And logic is the Logos Telos, which, by the way, is Hebrews. Hebrews is one of our Logos Telos documents. It's a historical document, but it tells us the Logos Telos of the early Christians in the 1st century and how they came about their way of thinking and ideas, right? And so are we persuaded? Well, I'm a scientist. That's my job. I'm a scientist. And I am absolutely persuaded. I think I'm a good historian too, and I'm persuaded. And I think I'm hopefully a reasonable logistician. And I think I'm persuaded, right? I'm persuaded. And when I tell my children, right? When you tell your children, I know that children go afar and go astray, but still, how can they not be persuaded if you teach them the historical method, the scientific method, and reasoning, right? And at the very worst, I'll just say this one thing, but at the very worst, how could they not believe or be persuaded if I go to them and say, I'm persuaded, right? Whether they can understand this or not, right? It doesn't take an intellectual to be persuaded. I can persuade a handicapped, a disabled, mentally, a person who's not all mentally there. How do I persuade them? I'm persuaded. See? Yes, sir.
So I think Thomas is a hero of the New Testament. We've hung this moniker on him, the Doubting Thomas, but his needing proof and then being a witness for us is proof for us. And he made the bold declaration, "My Lord and my God."
Yeah.
And all of the other disciples were a pack of cowards. You know, they were ready to run away and hide, and yet after Thomas, they all went on to be bold and face horrible deaths for having been persuaded.
For what they were persuaded, yes.
Totally related to that, if I could get philosophical and theological for a second. Ever since I started coming to your classes and learning more about pistis and like the Greek understanding of being persuaded and the meaning of the word faith and such, it's really transformed a lot of my thinking. But since the Bible says faith is a gift of God, and in Lutheran Church we teach that, whenever I sort of brought up that concept in other Bible studies or arenas, people get like really nervous and kind of like, well, that sort of makes it a work of ours if we're persuaded, but faith is a gift from God, and it's kind of goes along with our society's view of faith as being sort of a blind thing, like something you believe in because you hope it's true or you would like it to be true, and it doesn't really, there's nothing convincing about it, like the way evangelicals talk about faith, like you just gotta have faith, in hard times or whatever. To me, that's something you have to muster up yourself because there's nothing there. But when, the scripture says that we are, how do we come to faith? Faith comes by hearing, and hearing the word of Christ. And so I think the evidence, the word, the logical argument, all that is the gift of God that lets us believe in those things. And those are his ways of bringing it. And it's not that we do the work, but he gave this to us. If it was something that dropped from the sky on us, that we sort of are just like given, boom, or whatever, that everyone would be a Christian then. But so to me, I think we have sort of in our modern culture and even in our Lutheran culture, because we don't want to get too much into the Catholic like works righteousness, we have things backwards, and that we should see it the other way around.
As a matter of fact, to support your point, which I think is beautiful, it says in that specific verse you mean, it says pistis is the Duran of God, of Theos. Pistis is persuasion to a biological argument, a logos to telos. A Duran, anybody remember what a Duran is?
Sacrificial gift.
A sacrificial gift. Yes, a sacrificial gift. What is critical about that is why is a persuasion by a logical argument caused by a Duran?
Jesus.
Because it's Christ.
He
Exactly.
came down and sacrificed, his position in heaven to come here and be in front of us and with us. And
Yeah.
sacrifice himself.
When we read that, if we read that, and I hate to even say it, faith is a gift of God. When I say that, it sounds like faith, right? God gives me a gift. Here's a gift. You can have it. Right? And I have to lambano it. Take it. What? God's going to go, here it is. Right. You better take it or I'm going to, you're going to receive it, right? Well, that's not lambano. But anyway, okay. But if it's the sacrificial gift, which is Christ, this isn't faith is the gift of God. It's persuasion is because of the sacrificial gift who is Christ. Right? In other words, here's God, and he's holding Jesus, and Jesus is like alive. And God is going, here's the Duran. And now what do you do about it? Now, you know what? There's a lot of people There's a lot of historians in this world who have been presented the Doron of God. Here's Christ. And what have they done? I can't believe that. That's God. That's mysticism. There can't be any God. Hawking's. Oh, there can't be a telecaused universe. There's got to be aliens and little gaudy things, right? It's got to be. It's got to be because I can't believe in God.
We don't want to be accountable to him.
And yeah, well, that's a theological thing, but I agree.
That's a whole other way to go. But.
That's a whole nother, yeah, that's the other side, but you're right. You know, a lot of times I present, here's Christ. And by the way, do you know what? There's a huge scope of literature in the English language about this, right? You know this, right? There's a huge scope of poetry and literature about people who reject God.
Their hearts are hardened.
Their hearts are hardened, and there's enormous amounts of literature about it. But why do they reject God? They don't reject God because of the legal, historical, scientific, or logic. Why does almost every person reject God in literature? Because they don't want to stop doing what they're doing.
Because
Yeah.
of selfishness, you don't want to have to do it.
Right. You don't want to be accountable to God or follow His rules. You want to be a God unto yourself.
As a matter of fact, if you see modern movies and modern books, look at what they say. When the character comes to a moral standpoint where they have to make a moral decision, in most cases they say, oh, you have a great idea, but I'm not going to follow your ideas because I want to be myself.
Follow your heart.
I want to follow my heart. I want to do it my way. Do it my way, right? I want to be my own person. Yes, sir.
I knew a woman in college, and her brother had had a tragic accident, and she was angry with God and professed atheism because her only way to get back at God for what she perceived to be this accident was to not believe in it. So I think there's an element of people who have an anger with God, an outright anger, and choose to not believe because that's their only method of getting back at Him.
Yeah, it gets huge. And one of the reasons I don't like to dwell too much in theology is because that's our homework, right? So we should think about how these things apply in our lives, right? And what does it mean? And hopefully what I try to do is give you tools so that you can go to those who need it. Because I know a lot of scientifically minded and, modern thinkers, so-called, who would never accept what you just believed, right?
Right.
So here's some tools, and hopefully you'll have a chance to discuss it with them, right? And it's difficult, because it's even difficult in the Christian community to get people off their...
Right.
Well,
In
yeah,
modern-
if we don't go
modern
do what the
Christian
Hebrews
culture.
were doing, you're not gonna, that's why we're in the mess we're in, because we haven't been telling anything.
Like, they'll just say God said it, or, it's true, it's in the Bible or whatever, but there's nothing persuasive about, the modern Christian view of faith whatsoever, in my opinion.
I agree. Thank you, Father, for your word. We pray you look after us this week. In your name we pray. Amen.
Al and I have talked, and we think that this